All right, so at this point, we have now learned all of the different factoring methods that we're going to this first time around with factoring. I maybe should warn you just real quick. We've said many times in the course of our class together that we will be factoring for a long time this year. That will be one of the main skills that we will utilize over the course of the year. But one thing that I should add on is that later in the year, when we're doing factoring, using factoring to help us solve equations, at that time, we're going to learn a few more factoring techniques. We're also going to learn about problems at that time where the different factoring techniques have been mixed together. So in this video, what I'm going to do is sort of summarize what we've done so far. And this is going to be what we're going to need for the next few weeks. But I do want to warn you that later in our class, we're going to be adding on to this. And at that time, some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this video, we're going to tweak or change. And so just be aware of that. Depending on where you are in your factoring skills, you may want to watch the other video and not this one. Okay. However, if you're just keeping along with where we've been in class and all we have done so far is a few factoring methods focusing primarily on grouping, then this is going to be a great summary to help you know when to use which method. All right. And so that's what this particular video is about. Assuming that we will only use one method, how do you know which one to use? That's what this particular video is about. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. The learning objectives here, you can see that's it. Just simply know when to use each of the different methods, right? Now, what I'm going to show you in just a second, I'm going to turn the page here. And what I'm going to show you are some factoring problems that are already completed. Notice the goal of this is not to learn how to factoring. So the problems that I'm going to be putting on the screen here in just a second, if these are problems that you look at my work and you're not sure what I'm doing and you're not sure where they come from, then you need to go back and watch the videos that explain that particular factoring method. All we're going to talk about in this video is how to know when to use which one. Okay, so first, a quick summary of the methods that we've learned. All right, here's our first method, greatest common factor. Okay, greatest common factor was the first method we learned. If you want to pause the video and look over my work, but here it is. This is the first method we've learned. And at this point in our class, with what we have learned so far, I'm going to call this kind of our catch-all method. As we go through and we look at all the other methods, you're going to see there's specific situations that tell you when to use those methods. But for this, it's a little bit haphazard and slightly random. It's possible that you could use it regardless of the number of terms or regardless of whether there's plus signs or minus signs. Basically, you could use this on any given problem. So what I'm going to say, knowing that for right now, you will only ever use one method, I would say either start with this one or end with this one. But what you really want to check is the other methods. Okay, so method number one, greatest common factor. I'm going to say for right now in our class, I'm going to say use this as your catch-all. Use this as your last resort. Save this for the end. Okay, so with that said, we'll come back to it in a minute. Even though it was the first method to learn, we used it in all our other methods. We're going to come back to it in a minute because I'm going to say we're going to save that method to be our last resort. Then we did grouping. And with grouping, we started with grouping with things that have 4 terms, and we moved on to grouping with things that have 3 terms. We finished by looking at things that have 2 terms. Okay. Now, with 2 terms, we also discovered there was a shortcut. So here's what I want you to notice right now. When it comes to grouping, if there are 2 terms, we've got a couple different things that might potentially happen. But if there's 4 terms, or if there's 3 terms, grouping was it. Grouping was the only method that we used, okay? So what I'm going to say, as far as knowing methods, okay, as far as knowing methods, I'm going to say this. If it has 3 or 4 terms, try grouping. At this point in our class right now, that's going to be your safest bet. If it has 3 or 4 terms, we're going to try grouping. Okay. Now, I will warn you, it is possible for me to give you a polynomial that has either 3 or 4 terms, either one, and you try grouping and you get to this step right here and you discover it doesn't work, right? Because remember, grouping only works if I can make these two parentheses identical, and it's possible that I could give you a problem where that's not possible, okay? So 9 times out of 10, just playing the game of school here for a minute, 9 times out of 10, because we're doing these problems in class for the purpose of learning how to do grouping, if you try grouping, it's going to work, okay? If it doesn't work, don't let that freak you out. We're going to save greatest common factor as a backup. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, what about if it has 3 terms? What about if it has 3 terms? This is the one where we have to be a little careful. Okay. Notice one thing, it doesn't matter if I'm using grouping or if I'm using the shortcut. Notice that if I have 2 terms, I think I misspoke a second ago. Did I say what if it has 3 terms? We're looking at 2 terms right now. So if I misspoke, I apologize. We're looking at 2 terms, things that have 2 terms, okay? We know, we've talked about in class, that you can only use this shortcut on problems where you can take square roots. We also know, we've talked about in class, that in this part right here, I need a plus sign and a minus sign because I need things that will subtract to cancel out, right? That's where this is coming from. I need a plus sign and a minus sign because I need things to subtract to cancel out. So what I want you to notice right now is it doesn't matter if you use the shortcut or if you do it the long way, it doesn't matter which, there's the exact same requirements, okay? So if it has 2 terms, there's 2 things that have to be true. Well, I guess maybe you could say 3 terms. First of all, it has to have 2 terms. Okay, so that's the first thing. It has to have 2 terms. If it has 2 terms, it also has to have a minus sign. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're doing grouping or if you're doing the shortcut. If it has 2 terms, we're going to use problems that have a minus sign. And last but not least, these 2 things have to be things that I can take the square root of. So for a 2-term problem, I'm looking at that, okay? So if 2 terms, then we're looking for 2 things. First of all, part A, is it subtract? Is it subtract? And then part B, can you take square roots? I hope it's okay if I use the abbreviation here, SQRT for square root. Is it okay, or can you take the square root of both terms? Okay, of both terms. So if it has 2 terms, you're going to ask yourself these 2 questions. Is it a subtraction? Can you take the square root of both terms? If the answer is yes to both, if yes to both questions, if the answer is yes to both questions, then you can use grouping or the shortcut. Whoops, shortcut, your choice. Okay, so either grouping or shortcut, your choice. If the answer is no to any of the questions, one question, the other question, both question, it doesn't matter. If the answer is no to either or both, boy, I cannot spell today, questions. If the answer is no to either or both questions, then you cannot use grouping or the shortcut. And so what did we say our backup plan was going to be? We said our backup plan was try to use GCF. Try to use GCF. All right. So that then becomes our final point. If you cannot use grouping or the shortcut, use greatest common factor. Okay. Now, I want to back up for a second and make sure that we understand that final sentence in the grand scheme of things. I'm talking about all of these things. So 3 terms, 4 terms, we're going to try grouping. If I can't use grouping, I'm going to use GCF. 2 terms, we're going to ask ourselves these questions. If both questions are yes, I'm going to use grouping. Okay. If one question or the other or both questions is no, I'm going to use greatest common factor. I can't use grouping. Okay. If it's not 2, 3, or 4 terms, if it's 5 terms, if it's 6 terms, if it's 20 terms, whatever, I don't think we'll see many of those in our class, but whatever, I'm just going to jump right to greatest common factor because I can't use grouping unless it's one of these scenarios, right? So greatest common factor is our fallback. If I'm not sure what else to do, I try greatest common factor. If I'm not sure what else to do, I try greatest common factor. However, if there's 3 or 4 terms, I'm going to suspect, because of all the evidence that we've had in our class so far this year, I'm going to suspect that grouping is going to work, and so I'm going to try it. If there's 2 terms and they are being subtracted and they are both perfect squares, then I'm going to suspect that I can either use grouping or the shortcut, and I'm going to try it. Okay. And that basically becomes our idea. When in doubt, use greatest common factor as your backup. Okay. When in doubt, use greatest common factor as your backup. But if it's clear to you that there are either 3 or 4 terms, use grouping. And if there's 2 terms, ask yourself these 2 questions to decide whether or not you can use grouping. All right. So that's our basic idea based on the methods we've learned so far, and based on the assumption that you will never need more than 1 method per problem. Okay. Now, again, later in our class, that assumption is going to be invalid. But for now, it's going to work. You're going to be fine. And this is the process that I would use. All right. So thanks for watching this video. In the next video, I have some examples where I use this process to help me make some decisions. But for now, this should do the trick. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.